There we go. Okay, so welcome back for week 2 for on writing true crime. Uh, this week we're going to talk about research and interviews. Last week was picking the perfect case. This week I want to get into, once you have your case, what do you do from there? How do you start? How do these interviews and how does the research work for true crime cases, whether you're writing a book, writing an article, developing a podcast? This is all going to be helpful, I think, I hope. Interviewing people that are victims of a crime and families of victims is really tricky. Oh, and we've got somebody here specifically saying they're interested in starting a podcast, so you're in the right place. So, you know, we're dealing with true crime. We're writing about the days, you know, that are likely the worst thing the worst days, the worst things that's ever happened to these people, whether they're the victims or families of the victims. So you have to, it's a very tricky business. And you have to figure out when to be very, you know, you want to always err on the side of caution. But let me tell you a story. When I was starting out as a reporter at Scene here in Cleveland, there was this true crime story that happened in Akron involving a man named Stephen Spade. It was a young man. He was in his early 20s. And he was murdered, and his body was found. It was a horrific event. His body was found on the side of the road out in the country, and he had been decapitated. He had been tortured, and then his body had been burned. And he was missing for a couple of days, and then his body found, and then they didn't know who killed him for many months. And I was sent out. My editor at the time said, hey, go out and interview his parents, because they, you know, the news had just come in that they had identified Stephen Spade's body. So I drove out. They were in Akron. I was in Akron, so which is why they asked me to do it. I drove out to his house, and his parents were in the backyard, and they were with other family members. And I'm not sure how long they had known when the police contacted them or how soon I was there, but it had to be relatively soon after they got the news, even within like an hour or two. And I came around the side and introduced myself as a reporter, and Stephen's father just tore after me and screaming. The other people were trying to hold him back. He said he was going to kill me, and almost assaulted me there. And I think it's possible I might have done the same in his position. You know, he had just learned about what happened to his son. And that really shook me up. I never wrote that story. It was passed off to somebody else. And it made me it soured me to true crime in general for a little bit. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. It was just such a visceral thing that happened. And that's been about the worst of it with the families that I've been involved with writing about. But you're dealing with raw emotions there. People are not thinking logically, and you're inserting yourself into the worst day of their lives. So you have to be mindful of that, especially right now. You should always be mindful of it, but there's a movement going on right now in the true crime community where, famous victims or family members of victims are trying to change things for the better. One of these people, that I've met along the way is a woman named Sarah Turney, whose sister Alyssa went missing several years ago, and her father has been charged with murder, even though they don't have a body. So it's a very personal, tricky situation, because there's this young woman who has a podcast and is speaking out about her father, who's the main suspect. So she's really trying to push for more responsibility in how things are reported, and wants things to be victim centric, which is a great thought, and we needed to move towards that. However, it can also go too far. There has to be some sort of line there where we can't go all the way to allowing family members and victims to dictate what's covered. Why? Because 90% of these cases of murder, of disappearances, the culprit ends up being, like 90% of these cases ends up being a family member or somebody who knew the person. So you wouldn't want Scott Peterson to have any input on how the media covered Lacey's case. So you have to kind of balance it out and weigh out the pros and the cons, have to kind of find a middle ground. But the most important thing that you should be asking yourself is whether or not this crime should even be reported or written about. And when I think about new cases to cover, that's the first question I ask myself is, what is the public gaining from me covering this case, or is it just sensational? And if you can't find an answer to that, then put it aside for now and look at other cases, maybe come back to it. But if you find a good solid reason to cover the case, and for me, I like to cover unsolved cases. So it's a very easy answer for me for a lot of these cases, because by covering the case, I can get the information out there, and by sharing information, it can actually help the case be solved. So, but whatever you're doing, you should be respectful and kindness goes a long way. If you can make that first impression and becoming, try and if you can make a friend with the people that you're interviewing, this family, if you can become a friend of the family, that's going to go so much further than just the strict journalist who's covering the case. And you're going to get a lot more information that way, and you're going to feel better for it. So once you set your sights on a case, and for me, a lot of what we're covering here are unsolved murders, or even solved murders. We're interested in true crime. There's always a body at the beginning, right? And then you move on from there. There are two ways to go about organizing your interviews. You can do what the police do, which is draw a bullseye on that victim and then slowly move out. So you start with the victim, you find out everything you can know about them, you move on to their husband, their wife, their mother, their father, their kids, everybody close to that victim, and slowly move away from them, gathering the information as you go. I prefer the opposite route. I like to start out on the fringes and then move inward. So you're interviewing. Let me give you a for instance. So the Amy Mahalovic case is the first case I did this with, the 10-year-old girl who was abducted and murdered in Bay Village in 1989. And the reason I did it, one of the reasons I did it that way, is I didn't want to approach her father without knowing everything I could about the case, because that felt kind of like gratuitous or some sort of violation. I wanted him to know that I respected the case and respected the story. So I started way outside with the police who investigated the case, working my way inward at people who kind of knew the family or Amy, into the circle of friends, and then into distant family, all the way up to her father. And one of the reasons I like doing that is because you learn so much about the case, and you hear these stories from other people, and then you get to the middle there, and you speak with the parent or the spouse or the children, and they're going to tell you what other people got wrong. So, which is very helpful. Some stories have been twisted, and they know the accurate version, and they can help you fix those things. But also, some of this information that you've gathered, maybe they haven't heard yet. And so you're providing them with new information, and then you can piggyback off of that, and they'll say, oh, that's interesting that they think that person could be a suspect. I never thought of that. Well, I remember a story about how he came to our house once and commented on my daughter's earring or something. So some new info can get picked up with that. Also, here's another reason I like that, is because if you're looking at a case where they have a really good suspect or a couple really good suspects, if you start outward and work in, people are going to start talking. They're going to say, hey, this reporter called me up. He's looking into the case. I'm sure he's going to talk to you eventually. And there's just this chatter that happens with the people at the center of that case. And if they're nervous about something, if they're nervous because they were a part of it or they did something wrong, they're going to get really fidgety. And by the time you actually make it to them, they're going to be so anxious that you're going to pick up on that energy, and you're in it, and you're going to realize that they're nervous to talk to you. So it's a little intimidation against the people that might have had something to do with the crime, and it's helpful if you're eventually ending up with the family. Okay, I see a couple people asking questions. Thank you very much. In order to keep the flow of this going, what I'm going to try to do is, I think Marcia's in here. Marcia, if you can kind of keep an eye on the chat. If you have questions that are relevant specifically to the topic, so if you had questions about this process of interviews, happy to jump in and answer as they come. Otherwise, let's hold questions until the very end, and then you can ask me anything. And we'll have a specific section for questions and answers, and we can talk about any other case you want to. So those are, you can start. So you can either start at the bullseye and work your way out, or you can start outside and work your way in. So you just have to choose and see what works best with that case. So when you meet with somebody for an interview, how does that go? First of all, don't do it over the phone. Don't do it over Zoom. It's always worth the time and effort to meet in person, even in this day and age where we can jump on Zoom and we can talk to each other face to face. There's many reasons for that. One, on Zoom, it can be very artificial. Let me just swivel this around. This is the room above my garage, and we've got lights up here and everything. But here it just looks like a cozy little nook or library. But if you come into my office, my little studio, you're going to see how it's set up. You're going to see I've got boxes of evidence. I've got stuff on the walls that people have sent me over the years, posters and things. And you're going to have so many more opportunities to talk about things with the person you're interviewing. You can say, hey, why do you have this picture of Clint Eastwood, up there? And I can tell you a story about why it's there, which involves my grandfather in World War II, of all things. So if you put in the shoe leather and go to that person's house and see them in their setting, you're going to learn so much more about them. Is the house super clean and tidy? That tells you something about their personality. Are they a hoarder? I went to a house once during an investigation into a missing persons case, and their father was living in absolute total squalor, just bags of garbage everywhere and cans of dog food, and that tells you a little something about that dynamic, that family. And so and beyond that, there's something about sitting in a room with somebody and where you just feel a little more human. You let your guard down. It's just two people talking. There's no dealing with digital stuff. So I always prefer to meet in person if it's an important interview. And if that means driving a few hours or hopping on a flight and going to visit this person, that goes a long way, especially with family members of these victims of true crime. They're getting calls all day from reporters, but the reporter that comes and takes the time to meet them at their home, meet them at a local coffee shop, goes a long way. And they see you as an actual human being instead of just somebody else on the phone. So always, with these important interviews, I would recommend in person. Before you begin the interview, it's very important to set the parameters of that interview. And you have to decide, along with the person you're interviewing, is this interview on the record? Is it on background? Or is it off the record? On the record means you can use anything, you can quote them. So you should also be taking notes. If you're recording, you should let them know you're recording, which I'm going to jump a little ahead and get to this point. But since we're talking about it, every state, their laws are a little different. And in Ohio, we are what's considered a one-party consent state. And that has to do with recording people and interviews. So in Ohio, I technically don't need to tell you I'm recording an interview because I know I'm recording it. So as long as one person knows it's being recorded, you can do that and use it. Now, if I were to record you without your permission in the state of, let's say, Virginia, which is I believe, or New Hampshire, let's go with New Hampshire, because I know New Hampshire is a two-party state. Now, in order for me to use that, I have to know I'm being recorded, and I have to tell that person that I'm recording them. And if I don't have that, it's technically what's called a wiretap, and it's illegal. You could get in trouble for that, not just sued, but you could technically be, I don't know if I've never heard of somebody being arrested for that, but it's breaking the law. So set your parameters. Is it on the record? If it is, you can quote them, but if you're going to quote them, if you're not recording them, you should be taking very, very detailed notes. Or another option is you can interview them on background. And that means you can use the information that they are providing, but not for attribution, meaning you're not going to quote them in the article. So that's kind of like a middle ground. And some people who are hesitant to go on record because they don't want to be quoted, you can say, well, talk to me on background. Let me at least get that information. It'll open up some other doors for me. I'll know what's accurate and what's not. So that's your middle ground. But in all cases, you're trying to get them on the record 100%. That's what you should be shooting for. Don't just use on background because it's there. The other option is off the record, and you want to be very careful with that and use it as sparingly as possible, because if somebody tells you something off the record, it's not like on background. You can't really use that information. There's very few things you can do with it. Some people use it to just, they've got two sources already, but they want somebody else to say, hey, yeah, this is accurate. And they'll talk to them and, they'll say, yeah, off the record. Absolutely, that's true. So keep off the record for, your last, bit of, if all else fails. Oh, this is very important. So say you conduct an interview and for whatever reason, you didn't completely set the parameters of that interview first. You just started talking. The assumption in that case is that it is on the record. So you call up, a source, and they start talking to you and they tell you this information, and then 5 minutes later they're like, oh, wait a second, this is off the record. Well, you can't do that. Saying off the record does not work retroactively. There's an assumption that by talking to you, they know you're a reporter, they know you're a journalist, they know this is for a story. The assumption is you're going to use this, it will be on the record. So sometimes, and a lot of professional reporters do this, and it drives me crazy because I think it's a little underhanded, but a lot of really professional journalists, we're talking like at the major papers in the country, will call you up and just start talking and asking questions. And they don't set the parameters because they know whatever you're saying is on the record until you set those parameters, until you say off the record. So somebody calls you up and you don't want to be quoted, you got to say right away, everything I tell you is off the record or on background. Give me just a moment. I got to turn the heat down a little bit. Hold on. I'm in an old house and it gets very noisy when the heat comes on. Gremlins in the pipes, I think. So you've got your interview, you've set it up, you've set the parameters. What questions do you ask? I recommend not starting off with tough questions. Nothing like, where were you on the night of the murder? Or, did you take out a life insurance policy on your wife before she fell down the stairs? I always start out easy. Sometimes I'll tell them some stories about me and why I'm interested in this case and what sort of personal connection I might have. And then I'll ask them just to tell me about themselves. Or if it's at a location, a little town that I'm unfamiliar with, I'll say, hey, on the way in, I passed this ice cream place. It seemed kind of quaint and cool, tell me about that. And you're just kind of getting them comfortable with talking to you as if they're sharing stories. The most important thing, though, is to let them talk. And when I was a reporter just starting out, this is something that I consciously had to teach myself and consciously had to fix, because I knew the questions I wanted answers to. And I would start to talk to the person I was interviewing, and they would veer off topic, and I'd constantly interrupt them, and I'd bring them back, and I'd say, no, tell me more about this. And they'd veer off topic, and I'd be like, well, okay, but yes, here's what I really want to know. But what I've found is, if you just give yourself time and not be concerned about how long you're spending with this person and what you need to know, if you let them talk and they veer off and they become more comfortable, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get something really awesome that you never expected, and you never would have known how to ask them in order to get that question or in order to get that information. So, so many little tips came that way in the Moore Murray case and the Amy Mihalovic case, just by letting people talk. How do you build a buffer for the interview time? Asks Athena. I guess what you're asking is, how do you plan out the time? Or can you ask that question again, more specific? Okay, how do you plan out the time? Whenever I write a book, when I know I'm really going deeply into a story, I never plan more than one big interview in a day, because I know that interview could last 5 minutes, or it could last 15, it could last an hour or 2. You got to let them set the time frame on that, because again, goes back to this, you got to let them talk, because they will veer off onto these avenues and give you information that you would never know how to question to get that information you would never see coming. So I would say don't even worry about the time frame. Just commit to the fact that this interview could last a couple hours. So do what you need to do to prepare for that. Drink a lot of coffee beforehand. Make sure you don't have anything to jump away from the interview for. You don't have to go pick up the kids at a certain time. Set aside your day just for that one interview. Sorry, I'm checking questions here. What about just saying, tell me what happened and let them go, then ask questions? I think for me, that's never really worked because it's a little off-putting. It makes them, I think, feel that you're only interested in that one thing. And there are some people that I refer to as golems that you'll run into that have a little piece of information in a cold case or in any sort of story you run into. They have an important bit of knowledge. And there are some people that hoard that because they know it makes them special and they don't want to share it. And if you go running into them saying, give me that information, I want that information, they're going to protect it and put it in their pocket and not let you ever see it. But if you let them talk and you even say, I know you probably have information, you were really close to the individual, I'm here if you want to share anything. They're going to want to pull that out and say, hey, look what I got. This is really cool. What do you think? But there are, so people tend to be very protective if they know that information is important. Sounds like the questions shouldn't be too open-ended. I really leave the questions. I pretty much leave it open-ended. I just, every once in a while, I'll ask a new question to kind of veer them towards the subject at hand, but just try to find the interest in everything they're saying. Let me jump off questions for a minute. Let's go a little further. This is the way you're conducting interviews. It should, if anybody has a background in improv, it should seem very similar to improv and some forms of acting, in that you're not just sitting there waiting for your turn. You're not sitting there waiting to ask the next question. You might not even know the next question. I've gotten to the point where when I interview somebody, I typically don't bring a list of questions with me. I know the one or two important questions I want to ask that eventually I will ask in that interview, but I want to let them lead the interview. They should feel like they're leading the interview. And it's similar to improv in a way, because like in improv, you're on stage and you're not waiting for your turn. You're reacting to that other person in real time. And so whatever they come up with, you're the yes and. You're like you're say, oh, that's interesting, tell me more, or where can we go from here? That reminds me of something else that happened to me that is similar in this way. So you're building a connection, you're working with them, you're not just somebody that they're bouncing answers off of. Here's the question, the one question that I ask almost in every interview that invariably gets you some good answers. When there's room for it, when there's a pause in conversation, one of the things I'll ask them is, hey, this person that's missing, or this person that was murdered, when you are just walking down the street or driving in the car down the road, and you think of them, what is the memory that pops up in your head? So what is a specific memory? Like, let's go back to the Amy Mihalovic case. I'd ask a friend of hers, when Amy pops into your head, what is that memory? And one of her friends, Christy, told me, she said, oh, I remember every day after school, we'd sit in this big recliner and we'd cuddle with each other and we'd watch the monkeys because we had crushes on all the monkeys. And that's such a nice little detail that tells you a little bit about the girl's interests and character and life that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So and those memories are very dear to people, and sometimes they'll say more about the person than, strict facts. So what is the first memory that comes to mind when you think of this person? Here's something that I think a lot of beginning reporters and journalists don't think about, but it's part of the process is protecting yourself, especially nowadays. 20 years ago, we would have all had, small jobs in newspapers or weeklies or wherever, where you're protected by that corporation's lawyer, you're protected by editors. We don't really have that anymore. A lot of us are freelance and doing this on our own time. But the way you keep notes, of these interviews is very important in the rare case that you get sued after publication. And I'm going to tell you why. And it has all to do with consistency. So every reporter has a slightly different way of retaining notes. I've everywhere from, the old school reporters who do nothing but talk to somebody and they keep it all in their head because they can recite exactly what that person said in a quote and they've remembered it all. I don't know how you do that. That's so scary. I take very detailed notes. I don't usually record an interview unless I think that person might have reason to say, oh no, I didn't say that later on, in which case I will record the interview and I'll save it. But whatever you do, the most important thing is consistency. So if you just keep, I'm going to get to why that's important here in a second. Because let's say on the rare occasion you've published this story and the person comes back at you and says, this is defamation. This is, you treated me poorly. You were after me to begin with, and you were trying to ruin my reputation. Then you find yourself in a court case, in civil court. It's not a criminal charge. You're going to find yourself in a civil court, and then their lawyer is going to say, okay, show me your notes. And if you've retained those notes or the recording, they're going to get a court order. They're going to get those documents. Now, what's tempting in that case is to destroy all that, right? Because then they don't have any evidence to point to. But then they're going to go back and say, okay, give me the notes to your last 5 interviews. Give me your notes to the last, for the last 10 articles you've published, or the last 5 books. And if you go back and all of those records are there, but the one for this case you're being sued is gone, then they assume that you've destroyed those and you may get charged for destruction of evidence. So, but if you've got a habit of keeping those notes for 6 months and then destroying them, or keeping them for a year and then destroying them, and you can go back and say, oh, no, this is how I do it all the time. Yes, go back and look at my previous stories. You can see this is how I've always done it. Then that protects you to some point. But I like to keep detailed notes. And, if somebody disagrees with you at the end of the day, it could become their word against yours. But it's if they're suing you, it's up to them to show malice. It's up to them to show that the information you've published is not true, which you wouldn't do anyways. But the point there is consistency. You have to remain consistent with how you do it in the off chance that you do get sued. The only time I've run into this is, so my method, like I've talked about a little bit, is detailed notes and recording, but just the people that I think might challenge me at the end for whatever reason. And then with the true crime books, the books come out, and then about 6 months later, I pack up everything and I take it to Kent State. And Kent State's my, where I graduated. And their library has a special collections archive, and they've started a true crime section, not just with my stuff, but like the Kent State shootings and all this other stuff, but they're interested in true crime there. So when I'm done with a book, eventually I give all my notes to them. They pack it up and they sequence it so that any student that wants to come in and learn about the process or learn about that case specifically can request to see all those files, and they can go back through my notes and see who I interviewed when. And so it's fun to share that information to other people. Well, with the Maura Murray case, her boyfriend got charged with sexual, not assault, they called it felony sex abuse in DC for attacking a woman in 2011. In fact, he was just sentenced in that case last week. But a couple of years ago, his lawyer got a subpoena to get my records from Kent State, and was able to go in, and we fought it. And they wanted the whole file, which was thousands and thousands of pages of records. They ended up getting, I think, 7 pages, and wasn't really anything important in there. They were just trying to see what they could get. But if I had destroyed them, I would have been in big trouble. So you never know. So I mentioned 2-party consent states. And yeah, the point there is consistency. Last thing we should talk about when it comes to interviews is protecting your sources. And this is kind of really fun stuff. I think it's kind of fun as far as journalism goes, because sometimes, especially when you do this long enough, you develop some really good sources within, let's say, the government, or within a court, or the police, and they'll start feeding you information because they know that that you'll get that information out there. There's a particular case that they're stuck on, they want to share it with you, and they'll give you this information. Well, you have to protect those sources, and your whole this guy Michael Roberts, he's the old school journalist I talked to you about before, who could interview a subject and retain it all in his head. He's in his 70s. He's here in Cleveland, and every once in a while we'll get together and meet up at a bar, and he'll tell me these old stories. Well, he told me once, and it's something I remember, I think about a lot, is a journalist is their bread and butter is their credibility. They're only as good as their credibility. Once a reporter's credibility is shot, they better find another business. So one of the ways you establish good credibility is by protecting your sources. So, and that means that you must be willing to go to jail to protect your source if you get in a situation where a judge or prosecutors or police department's coming after you and demanding to know where you got that information. How you got that police report, how you knew about this FBI investigation that you shouldn't have known about, how you got these sealed records. You better tell us your source, because they're in trouble. You better say, no, I'd rather go to jail. Most of the time, they're not going to put you in jail. Sometimes it happens. There's this guy, William Farr, in 1972, and he had the record for a while. For the longest time, he's spent in jail for it's contempt of court when you don't work with the court. So thrown in jail for contempt of court. He served 46 days in 1972 because he wouldn't give up the source who gave him documents from the Charles Manson trial that were published in, I think it was the LA Times. So the judge said, "Who gave you these records?" He said, "No, I'm not going to tell you." Put him in jail for 46 days. Then they let him out, because in the United States, it doesn't look good if you're putting journalists in jail. So it's not, they do it as a point. They're making a point. They're not going to keep you in there. So far, the longest any journalist has spent in jail was pretty recently. A young man named Josh Wolf spent 226 days in jail for not releasing video that he had taken of a protest in San Francisco. I think the police or the prosecutors wanted to try to identify some of these quote unquote anarchists up there. And he wasn't, the point of journalism is to share the story. You're not there to put anybody in prison, really, So he protected his source. He was in for 226 days before they let him out. By the way, you do that. you go to jail for protecting a source. You come out. It's like getting an extra badge in journalism. People are going to respect you just for that. So it's never a bad thing. You can do 46 days in jail. You get some reading done. So that's the interview process. I want to go into research now, but let me just check the chat real quick. Okay, everybody's kind of caught up, it looks like. So let's talk a little bit about research. You've got the interviews, the one-on-ones with the people, but a lot of the information for true crime articles, yes, you can read my books while you're sitting in jail. I think some of them carry them. So a lot of research comes from gathering documents, and documents are great. Remember, I talked about this last week because if you have trial transcripts, if you have police reports, that protects you from any sort of defamation charge because they're what's considered privileged communication. Even though somebody says, if somebody were to say, Hillary Clinton is really a lizard alien from another galaxy and she eats babies. If they say that in court in open testimony, you're not going to get sued for defamation, even though clearly, she doesn't eat babies. So documents are great. That's where you're going to rely on a lot of those. So the Freedom of Information Act, it's a product of the 70s, I believe. But the idea behind it is a really good one, and that is that a fair government should not be run in secret. Our government is, for the people, by the people, but it's paid by our tax dollars. So why shouldn't each one of us have access to what it is that they're doing and the reports that they're generating and the investigations that they're conducting with our money? They are public servants. They work for us. So we should have that information. That's what's kind of behind that. It's slowly been chipped away at, but it's still pretty good in the United States. The FOIA Act covers most government documents, state and federal. Mostly you're going to be dealing with police reports, prosecutor files, personnel files of government workers. Like I said, there's federal rules and state rules. Each state should have a little booklet somewhere on their website, usually at the Attorney General's website, that talks about sunshine laws in that state and how to request public records. And it's worth taking the time to read that beginning to end. They're 20, 30 pages long. Take the time to read through that and understand it. In Ohio, where I live, all police records become, and that includes detective notes, because a lot of times you'll ask for police reports and then you'll say, no, this is just a summary. Give me your notes. And they're like, no way. But in Ohio, all police reports, including investigative notes, detective notes, handwritten notes, investigative files, booking photos, aka mugshots, all of that becomes public the moment a suspect is charged in the crime. And one of the reasons for that is because in Ohio we have pretty liberal discovery laws, meaning that the prosecution can't hold anything back from the defense attorneys when they charge somebody and go to and plan to go to trial. So all that becomes discovery for the defense, and part of that makes it all public record for journalists, for anybody. And most anybody can get this info. There is one little weird thing in the Ohio laws where only journalists can view autopsy photos. So Joe Schmo from down the road, puts in a request to see autopsy photos. They can say, and a lot of times they'll just say, fine, here you go. But sometimes they'll say, no, you got to be a journalist, and it has to be with a newspaper that's a part of this, association with the state. So journalists in our state, at least, have a little bit more access to laws than everybody else. Not much, though. Let me see, Crystal with a question. I've been told in Iowa that even if a case is closed, not all info can be given out in case it ever comes up for appeal. I'm talking about a case that was closed 7 years ago. That's interesting to me, and I'm going to give you some ways around that, hopefully. That sounds like an excuse to just make you go away. A lot of times these police departments and prosecution and AG's office will go the insurance route, which is deny first. 90% of us go away and don't ask again. And then if you keep asking, if you go through the steps, they'll eventually give it to you. But it's very easy to say no at first. But feel free to email me directly, because that always infuriates me, and I'm sure I can help with that. So a FOIA request can be very, and should be very simple. Whenever I make a FOIA request, it's really just this. It's whatever person I'm sending it to, the records department at a police department, or the records room at a prosecutor's office, or judge's chambers. It will read this, and you have to, just say it right out. This is a FOIA request for the following information, : and then it's usually one line below that, all records. And sometimes I'll spell it out, but sometimes it's just all records, but sometimes I'll say all records, and then quotations or parentheses, including but not limited to detectives' notes, investigative files, all police reports, booking photos, end quote, and parentheses, pertaining to this individual, name the individual. And a lot of times they'll need the date of birth, which is pretty easy to find online. Date of birth, give it, put that out, and then that's it. Signed, James Renner. You can put something in there where, like, I'd prefer to get this information as PDFs sent over email. But if you need to put them in mail, here's my mailing address, and send it out. They have, I believe it's 2 weeks to respond to those requests. Got a couple questions coming in. I've submitted 2 FOIA requests. The first one was very short and had most of the info redacted. The second one is still in the works and will take 57 months to process, as there are over 1,300 potential pages. I would that's through the FBI. They're pretty difficult. I've never heard that length of time before with, like, state level stuff, but maybe federal, it's more difficult. Jane asks, does a FOIA request carry more weight than Ohio public records requests? In Ohio, I use, although I probably shouldn't, I use them pretty much interchangeably. That's a good question. I don't know. If you find the answer to that question, let me know. I've never run up on a problem with that. So it's a little trickier when you're dealing, I'm going to take a break from this questions for a second. It's a little trickier when you're dealing with unsolved cases where nobody's been charged. But they can't just come to you and say, oh, it's an open case. It's active and ongoing, so we can't release any information. That's bullshit. So what you're, in that case, you can get some information. It's going to be very limited, but they can't just say no. In that case, you're going to, here's a very magical phrase. Show me the Vaughn index is what you're going to ask. And that's VAUGHN. I'm going to type it in the chat. Ask for a Vaughn index. And what that is say, and we ran into it in the Moore and Murray case for sure in Massachusetts, where, or New Hampshire, they don't want to release any information in that case. So, I asked for a Vaughn index, and a Vaughn index is where they have to go through every single piece of information in that case, every single report, and explain why that specific report cannot be released. And what you generally come away with is at least some records partially redacted. So, because it's very easy to say, oh, by releasing that information, it's going to harm the investigation, or it's going to identify confidential informants. And you're saying, okay, I understand that, just redact that name. And so this Vaughn index came about because police departments were just saying, no, we're not going to release any information. Eventually somebody sued them. I'm assuming that person was named Vaughn, and or pertained to a case with Vaughn, but now they have to provide, if they're saying no, they have to provide a Vaughn index to explain why. So that's been very helpful. Let me jump on. Let me see if I can share the screen here. Did I miss a question in the chat?
Yes, there was. How specific do the FOIA's requests need to be?
They don't need to be that specific. The important bits of information that you're asking about are specific people. So if you're asking for a record pertaining to a suspect or a victim, you just have to be specific with that person, because a lot of times they'll come back and say, oh yeah, there's like 100 people with that name. And which is why you need that date of birth and social security number if you have it, but a lot of times you won't, of course. Let me show you my screen, and we'll jump into a FOIA request here. View. Hang on one second. Show captions. Share screen. Here we go. All right. Everybody see the screen here?
Yes.
All right, great. Let's go here. Can I move this thing? Yeah, great. And jump over to, well, that's Pacer. I don't want that. There we go. Okay, so it's very easy to hop on the FBI page and make a FOIA request for whatever you're looking for. So let me fill this out. You want to put in name, address. You guys are going to know my address, so don't give it out to jerks or anything.
Hey, James, while you're typing the follow-up question with what to put on the FOIA request, they said the case is over 1,000 leads, and they're afraid that they'll come back and say, what specific info are you asking about? Does that make a difference?
Not really. You could narrow it down to say, I'm just looking for any interviews that the police conducted with individuals, or their summary reports or anything like that. You could help them by making it a little more specific, but you don't really have to. Phone number, why won't it let me? Oh, okay, there we go. Oh, there we go. I see why. See, some of their fields are a little specific. Okay, who has a fax machine anymore? So what do we want to get from the FBI? Anybody can ask them about UFOs or whatever. I want to learn a little bit more about, and Jane's on here who's written about Ted Conrad. He's this young man who took about $210,000 from a bank in Cleveland in 1969, went on the run, and nobody found him until he died, like last year or the year before that. and he was living under a different name in Massachusetts that whole time. So there's definitely FBI records about him. So let's see what we can get.
James, real
Yeah.
quick, Amanda asked, would you use the same form for any FOIA request? And if it's local?
No, let me jump on that in a second. Let me complete this FBI request because they're all a little different. All records pertaining to subject Ted Conrad, and very easy to find a date of birth here because he has a Wikipedia page, July 10th, 1949. Date of birth, July 10th, 1949. Who was a fugitive from Cleveland until his death in 2021. In order to help the individual determine status to assess fees, if you're part of you can make a case that you're a journalist and sometimes get the fee waived, but you can also do that later. Right now, I'm just going to say an individual seeking information for personal use. I am not directly affiliated with a private corporation seeking information for the company's use. I could make an argument that I'm a representative for news media. Purpose to learn about the process of investigating this fugitive. A maximum amount you're willing to pay. I usually just put $100 in here. It's never, it's probably not going to be more than that. If it's, you probably won't be close to that. Explanation. This is where you can request a waiver for fees. I could say that, I'm doing this for journalistic purposes. I'm gathering information to use in long form journalism pieces. Additional comments. I don't have any. And then you are ready to go. So hit send. With the FBI, it's really that easy. This form cannot be used. All right.
James, Kyle asked, would there be anything different or extra if also doing a FOIA on the alias? Would the records be separate?
Hang on one second. Let me turn off stop share. Let's get back to this. Give me that question one more time. Let me jump over to the chat. I'm gonna look into the chat here. Hold on. Can you specify a certain case versus a specific person? Yes, absolutely. Requesting FOIA. I remember there was a question, can you use that form for FOIA requests? I think you probably could, but remember, 90% of the FOIA cases I send are to directly to police departments or prosecutors' offices in Ohio and Massachusetts, and it's just an email. And you start off with that one line. This is a FOIA request for the following information, that information you're looking for. And then sincerely, James Renner, here's my contact info. And I think they have 20 days or so to reply to that request, depending on where you're at. Ask for Von Index. Let me get through these questions here. How specific do FOIA requests need to be? They don't need to be that. I wouldn't start specific at first. Let them make you go more and more specific. Now, let me say this. If they give you a no and you come back to them with a FOIA request and they're like, no, and you come back with the Von Index thing, and they're like, still no. In almost every state, I believe, there is a system for appealing these decisions that most people don't do. And it's a headache for them. So if you can do it at that point, then it's so much more paperwork for them, this appeals process. And generally you can say, look, if you just give me this info, I'll drop the appeal. And they will. And I've gotten a ton of information because of that through Massachusetts, which has a very cool, very strict appeals process. And it's a whole department in the Massachusetts state government, an office for appealing FOIA requests. And they work with you, and you can get somebody on the phone and walk through your case, and they act as mediators. So you give them all your request and everything you're asking, then the police and the prosecutors have to go to them and say, here's why we don't want to release it. And then the mediator will say, well, you have to release this. Don't be stupid. And so that's always worked for me, at least in Massachusetts. Ohio is a little more difficult. You have to go up to the AG's office, and a lot of times they just ignore it. But check out whatever state you're in. My cases have no named suspects. They're widely believed suspects. You probably won't get the name of an uncharged suspect until they're charged. Would there be anything different or extra if also doing a FOIA request on his alias? Would the records be separate? No, as long as the investigative agency knows that that person is that alias, they will, that typically it's the first page. They'll say, you know, Ted Conrad, AKA, you know, this person he was living under. How do you appeal? Jane asks. It's different in every state. Like some states like Massachusetts will have its own department handling appeals. And in that case, there's a really good chance if you take the steps to do it, and it can be tedious, but if you take the steps, you likely get that information. In Ohio, you have to look at the chain of command with these crime cases. So the crime's investigated by the police, and sometimes the prosecutor's office, or sometimes the coroner's office. And they all have this chain of command where the police go up to the prosecutors go up to the county prosecutor, who serves under the Attorney General of the state of Ohio, who serves, I believe, at the pleasure of, well, he might be elected in Ohio, but some of them serve for the governor. So there are always these steps, incremental steps that you can go up to. If the police say no, you can go to the prosecutors. If the prosecutors say no, you can go to the Attorney General and make your case. And sometimes that helps. And the you know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? You know, if you make enough noise, sometimes, you know, it's just give me what I want and I'll go away type of thing. Another thing you might run into are there's a lot of information in grand jury cases and testimonies, but in Ohio, I think just about any state, grand jury testimony is always sealed. You can't use it. But there was one early case that I was looking into involving a serial killer in Akron named Bob Buell, who was he was executed in 2002, convicted in the early 90s, I believe. But he was responsible for the deaths of several young girls in the Akron area back in the early 80s. And I went to, this is again why it's always as much as you can get in person and, you know, with interviews, but also research, taking the time to go down to the courthouse and seeing what files they have in their old records, or meeting the records person face to face sometimes, if you can do that. Because I went down to the county where this happened, I think it was Holmes County, and I said, hey, can I see the records for the Bob Buell case? And by that time, the case was like 20 years old and he had been executed. So they weren't worried about it too much, because they let me go downstairs to their microfilm room, and they gave me microfilm from this old case in the early 80s. And the guy said, look, I don't know what's on this. He said, but you're welcome to it. So I fired up the microfilm, and it was grand jury testimony. And I was quickly, like, as soon as I saw what it was, I was printing out every page because I knew as soon as he figured out it was grand jury, he'd take it away from me. And in that grand jury testimony is how I discovered that Bob Buell likely had an accomplice with him when he committed some of these murders, his nephew. And the prosecutor knew that because it came out in that grand jury testimony. The prosecutor kept saying, no, we don't need to hear anything about the nephew. Just tell us more about, how this guy really did it. So there's a lot of info they can keep quiet in the grand jury testimony. Let's see. There are records that most people don't realize are public records that are a wealth of information. And in Ohio, what's helped me a lot is the fact that state employees' records are public. And that means teachers. That means professors at state universities, meaning their personnel file, which is how I found out a couple suspects in the Amy Mihalovic case. I went back and pulled their personnel files. One guy was actually working for the State Park Service, which is also, public service. It's also open to public records laws. And I pulled his personnel file, and it showed that he called off work the day Amy went missing. And that became a huge clue that the police didn't even know about, that they were very interested in, and certainly brought that guy up in rankings of being a suspect. You can request emails from specific professors or teachers if you suspect that they are doing something underhanded. You can request. You have to be kind of specific. You could say, hey, I want any sort of emails between this professor and this person over here who I suspect is doing something illegal. And they will provide you with those emails. And a lot of times the professors, the teachers don't even realize that those are public. And, so they'll be very candid and open in those emails because they think they're private, but they're not. So keep that in mind. Sometimes you can use FOIA requests for what's called, oh, I'm sorry, I missed a couple questions here. Would having a lawyer file FOIA appeal be beneficial in your opinion? Yeah, if you have a lawyer, that goes a long way, because that's you saying, I am going to take this as far as it will go. If we have to take you to civil court and get what's called a writ of mandamus, which is the court saying you have to turn over these records. You just have to do it. It's part of your job. So yeah, a lawyer definitely helps if you if you have a lawyer that's friendly enough with you that you can do that. Do we ask the job for the personnel files? Not quite sure I understand that question. To get the personnel files, you have to have the name of the instructor or the person you're looking at. Yeah, so yeah, if you have a lawyer, always going to help. So back to FOIAs. Some people use them as sorry, let me fix the view here. So I forget that I'm recording this. Full screen. All right. So you can use it as a fishing expedition. And let me tell you how this works. And sometimes people will look down on it and say, he's just on a fishing expedition. Don't give him anything. But there are some ways that it's always been beneficial for me. Let me give you an example. I used a FOIA fishing expedition for the Maura Murray case. When I started reporting on that young woman's disappearance, all we knew, and this is back in like 2011, 2012, all we knew about her is what was projected in the media, which is that she was this perfect, to a fault, all-American girl. I suspected that was untrue, that she was probably as complicated as any one of us. But I didn't know what was out there. So I sent out FOIA requests to police departments in every single jurisdiction I knew she had lived. So they went out to Hanson, where she grew up. They went to UMass Amherst. And a lot of times colleges have their own police department, and that would be a separate FOIA request. So I sent one to the campus police. I sent one to Hadley Police, which is outside UMass. I sent them to New Hampshire, where she disappeared, and Boston. So, and it could have been nothing. I could have got nothing back, but it's low risk and high reward. It'll take you probably a half an hour of your time, because you can use that same wording on every single one of the FOIA requests. All you need are the addresses. And this was before a lot of this was digital. You could probably do a lot of this over email now, but I got the addresses for the physical police departments and records rooms. And one day I sent out 10 letters thinking maybe nothing would come back. And then about 2 weeks later, I started getting packages in the mail, and some of them would just return, say, hey, we don't have any records on file. But then we got this packet from Hadley, Massachusetts, which outlined this whole case where at the time of her disappearance, Maura was in trouble for credit card and identity theft at UMass. And there was this whole sting operation involving her, where the police caught her charging food on a stolen credit card. And suddenly this becomes very interesting information, because did this have something to do with her disappearance? So it became a huge clue in that case. So you never know what you're going to find. You might find nothing, but you might find something really important to the case you're working on. So just send out FOIA requests that have, anywhere that the person is that you think is interesting in this case. It's also important to think outside the box, because unfortunately, some of these police departments and prosecutors' office, they think it's part of their job to keep the information out of the press. And that's not how it should be, but sometimes that's how it is, especially in smaller departments. So sometimes you have to get tricky about how to get that information. Let me give you one example. This is on the Amy Mihalovic case again. Up until I figured this out, nobody had seen her autopsy report, and she was murdered in 1989. And it was like 2007, 2008 before anybody saw the autopsy report. I was the first one to see it, and here's why nobody had seen it. Because Amy was from Bay Village, which is a part of Cuyahoga County, but her body was found in Ashland County, which is out in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. And there was a coroner there, very old gentleman, I forget his name, but he hated reporters. And so when her body was found in 1989, he didn't file his coroner's report for a year. He didn't file anything for a year. He waited until the media attention died down. Then he quietly filed his report. And so in 2006, 2005, I started requesting the autopsy report, because I realized nobody had seen it. I'm like, there's got to be some important information in there about possible suspects, evidence found on her body, everything. So first I requested from Cuyahoga County, and they said, oh, no, we can't give you the records because it's not our case. So I went to Ashland County and I said, hey, I want to see the autopsy report. And they came back and they said, no, we can't give you the report because we sent her body to Cuyahoga County and the autopsy was performed there. So they have all the records. So they got me in this weird catch-22, because Cuyahoga County couldn't release it because it technically wasn't their case. But Ashland County couldn't release it because they technically didn't have any of the reports on their location. So they didn't have any reports to give. And they kept kicking me back and forth for years. And it was driving me crazy. I couldn't figure out a way around it. And then one night, my wife, Julie, she's a teacher. She, at the beginning of the school years, they would have these meetings where they would have motivational speakers come and talk. And sometimes these motivational speakers would do weird things and like logic puzzles in order to get everybody's attention. And so there was this logic puzzle, and she came back and she told me this. And the puzzle went like this. You have a head of lettuce, a goat, and a wolf. on the shore, and there's an island on this lake, and they're all on the shore of the lake, and you've got a rowboat, and you have to take the lettuce, the goat, and the wolf over to the island, but you can only take one thing at a time, and you have to get all three over without the goat eating the lettuce or without the wolf eating the goat. So how do you do it? And so you think, okay, well, I'll take the goat first because the wolf won't eat the lettuce. You drop him off, you come back for the lettuce, and you take it over to the island, and you drop it off. It's like, wait, no, the goat ate the lettuce. I can't get the wolf. The key to figuring out that case, or that logic puzzle, is you have to bring something back. So you take the lettuce back to the goat, or to the island, then you put the goat back into the boat, and you drive it back to the shore. You swap out the goat for the wolf, take it over, and then you come back for the goat. You never think that you have to bring something back. And that made some sort of connection in my mind where I realized right then, I'm like, I know how to get these reports. So the next day I called up the Cuyahoga County coroner. Her name was Elizabeth Balraj, and she knew me right away because of this. And she's like, oh no, Mr. Renner, I can't give you the reports. And I said, no, I don't want the reports. She said, well, then why are you calling? I said, well, I'd like you to do me a favor. Could you make a copy of those reports and mail them to Ashland County? And she thought for a second and she laughed. She's like, yeah, I could do that. So I waited 3 days, and then I called Ashland County and I said, I want to see the autopsy report. And they said, oh no, we don't have the records. And I said, check your mail. And they called back in a half an hour, and they were pissed, but they're like, okay, come on down, you can see the reports. So that's how you got to think outside the box. There's always a way to get that information. Many of these records that you're looking for are available online. I'm going to share the screen again to show you just a little bit. Desktop. Let's go over to, there's a very helpful resource called Pacer. And this will allow you to gain access to court records in federal cases, the big cases. It doesn't require any money to register, but the way it works is you're allowed to access, I think, like 30 reports a month. Anything after that, you get charged like 10 cents per page. And that's not to print, that's to access. So you're reading it online. So most of the time I never go past the free stuff. So let me log in. Oh, it does this sometimes. Let me try to just reload here. Oh, here we go. Pacer court links, is that it? No, that's not it. Give me just a second. We'll figure this out. Pacer, search for a case. Pacer login. Oh, I thought I had this. Come on. Oh, there we go. Okay. The website's a little wonky. There we go. Because you don't need a client code. Okay, now I'm in. You can search by cases. You can search by parties. This is how I found crazy information, again, in the Maura Murray case. There was a representative, kind of a family liaison that was working with the Murray family for a while. And everybody kind of got the heebie-jeebies when they talked to him. So I'm like, I wonder if this guy has anything going on there. So I looked into him. His name's Scott Wall. And I did a Pacer search. I did this coincidentally on the anniversary of Amy's abduction. I just happened to be in a newsroom, and I'm like, we were looking up the case, and I'm like, let me check this guy out. So this comes up, and then you're like, oh, wait a second, he's in Virginia. That's got to be him. USA versus Wall. What do you got here? you go into you get this page and you go into the docket report that kind of gives you everything. You run the report. And then it comes up, oh, wait, he's been charged with receipt of child pornography and obstruction of justice. What do we have here? And that's how we discovered that this guy who was working as a liaison for the family, the FBI was monitoring his internet activity on the anniversary of Maura's abduction. And he was on my website. They had, at the time, I had a blog for it, and he was on that page, refreshing the page like every 5 minutes. And while he was doing that, somebody, who knows who it could be, somebody using that same IP address was downloading child pornography. And they were going back and forth from the pictures of the children to pictures of Maura to my website. Creepy stuff. So Pacer is a great resource for federal cases. Speaking of the Maura Murray case.
Oh, James, question with that. Does it show what prison a federal inmate is in?
No, but there's a separate website for that. It's a federal inmate search. I was just on there today for some other reason, but that's searchable too. And most states have searchable systems for inmates as well. So this is the website for DC Superior Court. Most, especially bigger jurisdictions and counties, will have access to court files online. DC does it very well. They're very open with it. And this is Maura Murray's boyfriend. Like I said, he was just sentenced in a sexual assault case last week. So you put in his name, pull up the file. So when you're starting out on research, the first place to look is what's available online. And as you can see, kind of you got the docket here, but here's where it gets fun, because all of this stuff on the right is stuff that you don't have to put in a request for, because it's all right here. Here's the last thing that was entered, which is just a sentence of the court. So check first before you FOIA, because the information you're after might already be available. So if you're interested, check that out.
James, another question in
Yeah.
chat. If the FBI is involved in a search, but it's prosecuted at the state level, will the FBI have a separate records to request?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would think both the FBI and the local police department would have separate records, and they don't like working together, even though they say so publicly. They keep a lot of records from each other, even though they shouldn't. So yes, they will have separate records. Okay. So we touched on some of that. Okay, last thing I want to mention, and then we'll open it up for general questions. There are some other avenues of research. So you've done interviews, you've FOIA'd police and prosecutors. Where else can you get information? Libraries are still a very good resource. They will have like university libraries specifically are sometimes archives for old newspapers. So in Cleveland, we have Tri-C in downtown, and they are the archive for the old Cleveland Press newspapers. And if you're in the area, it's really cool just to go in there and explore, because they have the old file cabinets, and you can search by cases, you can search by reporters' names, whatever. They're pretty much out of order, so you never know exactly what you're going to find. It's so fun to go through. But you open up some of these file cabinets, and there's old what they call onion paper, these almost transparent bits of paper. And this is what the reporters would jot their notes down to the copy room or their editor, and they'd put it in those tubes, and they could suck up into the vacuum tubes up to like the 5th floor and get spit out at the editor's desk. Essentially, they were emails before computers. And there's some fun information you can find in there. So check your local libraries for more information, especially if you're researching a historic case. Libraries will also have something called a crisscross directory, which is really fun. You can probably find a lot of this information on the white pages, but sometimes you can't. Crisscross directories are telephone books, but with the numbers first. So you're looking up, you have a specific number, you don't know who owned that number in like 1989, 1990. I used this a lot in the Amy Mihalovic case where I would get a phone number. I'm like, but I need to know who had that number in 1990. So you go to the library, ask for the crisscross directory for 1990, they'll pull it out, you search for that number, and it says, oh, that was Joe Smith. And here's his address. So it's like a backwards phone book, which is really cool. Sometimes libraries will have, they'll keep copies of local high school yearbooks. And sometimes I've even, when the libraries don't have it, I'll reach out to the school directly and say, hey, I'm a journalist. I'm researching this case, but I'd really, this person was a student at the high school in like 1963. Could I see the yearbook for that year? And a lot of times the school will keep that too. And I've never had a problem, even as a middle-aged white guy, with going into the school and letting them have, allow me access to those yearbooks. So that's fun too. The last thing is, you don't have so Crystal works in 2 libraries and doesn't have a crisscross directory. Now you have to look. Yeah, let me know what you find. It could be in, another library in your county. I don't know. The last thing is sometimes you'll hear this, you'll hear these tall tales, or, somebody that doesn't like reporters or journalists, they'll say, yeah, he's just digging through the garbage. You want to steer away from that, but I've done it once or twice, and you want to check your local laws to make sure it's legal. But in Ohio, as soon as you put that garbage out on the curb, anybody can have at it. It's not, you won't get in trouble for taking the garbage or getting information that way. The police do that a lot, and reporters do it sometimes. I remember when I was at scene, I was working with this guy named Chris Mogg, who went on to work for Time, and he he was really hurting for a story. So he went to the federal courthouse, and behind the courthouse were these dumpsters. And he came at like 2 a.m. and just dove into the dumpsters and took as many files as he could, took them back to his place and went through it. And he found a really good story that they were trying to hide that the prosecutors just threw into the bin. So I only do it if I have a really good reason to do it. I've only done it once or twice. And again, back to the Amy Mihalovic case, there was this, remember that I told you, I found out about this guy who worked for the park system, and I FOIA'd his records, and that's how I found out he had taken the day off that Amy was abducted. So I'm like, oh man, this guy, maybe he really did do it. And I went to his house to try to interview me or try to interview him. And at first he declined. And I'm like, well, now he knows I'm onto him. So he's going to get rid of whatever he has, and he's going to throw it in the garbage. So I'm like, well, I better figure out when he's putting the garbage out. So I called up the local garbage company and I said, hey, I just moved onto this road, his road. I said, when does the garbage get picked up? And they're like, oh, Thursday at like 2 a.m. So I drove out there like Thursday at midnight, and there was this bag on his curb, and it was like weirdly heavy. Like when I picked it up, it was like, oh, there's something important in here. And I tossed it into the back of my car, and I drove to like a car wash, like a 24-hour car wash that had some lights. And I got into the back seat and I ripped it open, and kitty litter went everywhere. It was a bag of used kitty litter and cat poop, and like just all over the back seat. And so now I'm that creep at the car wash at after midnight, trying to clean the back seat of his car out, like something terrible happened in there. I could never get the smell out, by the way. So that's why I don't really mess with that, because it's just, it's gross, and 9 times out of 10 you're not going to find anything, and it makes it look bad. So but you know, if all else fails, I guess. So I guess that's it.
James, real quick
Yeah,
question, another
questions.
in chat, didn't want to interrupt you.
Any
Should,
general questions now? Yeah.
oh, someone with the filing for FOIAs, they asked, should I request under a business name or as an individual because they have an LLC?
I would start out requesting as an individual. You know, see if they say no. If they say no, try the LLC. It probably won't scare them too much. I don't think it really matters. The only thing that you know would get them to think twice is if you requested through a lawyer, and specifically a lawyer that is known in town. So I wouldn't worry about putting the business in there.
And before any other questions, there were two early in the chat. I don't think you addressed, if I'm wrong. One was oh, sorry, let me go back. If you, how would the process differ